Hey everybody, it's Adam Olshansky and I with another session of Dev Up, where we talk about coding and what you need to learn as a beginning developer coming into the Salesforce ecosystem. Some deep back-end kind of academic code concepts that will help you along your way as you try and load code within the Salesforce ecosystem. If you're coming from a non-Salesforce background, it should help you understand what are the key concepts that are available as a developer in Salesforce. And if you're coming from a non-developer background, it should tell you what we try to tell you what concepts you'll need to learn in order to get up to speed on the development principles. Adam, please introduce yourself and say hello.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, so my name is Adam Olshansky. I'm a Salesforce MVP and Salesforce architect for Google Play. Feel free to connect with me on Twitter at Adam17AMO.
Great. Adam and I have been working in the Salesforce ecosystem for a bit, both as developers. Adam's extremely knowledgeable. I run the Dallas Salesforce user group. My background is dev in just about every language out there. I've probably written Hello World at some point or another. So happy to share kind of these compare and contrast sessions with you. I'm very glad to have Adam here for the high level of Salesforce expertise that he has. So thanks. All right, let's kick into it. All right, so one of the things we're going to be talking about here is the awareness of data flow and presentation layers. So if you're used to Salesforce from the front end, you know that you're clicking through pages and you may be hopping through different types of Salesforce components through different methodologies, but the single click path may not be the perfect representation of a code path. So we'll be talking about some of the layers and the layers that you'll need to be aware of that are going on behind the scenes when you do dev. We'll also be covering types of code. Sorry, I don't want to talk over you, Adam. Pitch in whenever you want. We'll be talking about types of codes and language specifications. Language specifications are kind of the official academic version of a language, and each platform can implement them slightly differently. Salesforce uses a lot of language specifications and has a lot of their own variants of language specifications. So when you hear something called JavaScript, watch for us talking about an asterisk next to this is special JavaScript or this is special Java. And then there's lots of different places where different types of code and different variants of language specifications can be used. There's not just one, the Salesforce code space. There's a lot of locations there. And that's what this session is going to focus on where and what types of code you can do.
Yeah, and I would argue that some of them may even surprise you. There are some places you might be coding without even knowing it. So we'll talk through that as well.
Absolutely. And then some of the central customization areas for Salesforce that have code, we'll cover those as well. And at the end, we'll talk about different tools and repositories that have their own scripting languages that may help you to be aware that there may be a need for code or a need for scripting or different languages when using those tools. So we'll get to those at the end. We won't be covering those in very much depth. All right, so let's get into the meat. All right, so data flow and process modeling. When you're starting into developing, one of the things you should be looking at, if you've never built a solution design before, is trying to keep the perspective of the user. It's real easy to get lost in code. So one of the main tips I give everybody, master empathy. Always think about the user that's using your tool and tie everything back to how they're going to use it. A lot of times you'll be writing code that nobody will ever see, but you'll still want to have mapped in your head how people are interacting with that tool and make sure that you're able to ask really good questions as you are trying to model what the user is trying to do. So I've got some samples of an odd take on questions here. You know, tell me about the first day of school that you rode a bus. Now you might describe the bus, what's in it, how many people, it was loud, but also you need to understand it from the bus's point of view. How many people got on? How many people got off? Did I have enough gas? were the same children here as there were from yesterday. So learning to surround your topic and not just be linear will be something you need to do as a developer. You've got to kind of swarm all of the concepts and make sure that you're looking at them, aware of them, and understanding more of what's going on. So some of what we'll be doing is kind of peeling off some of the layers, and you'll have to get used to being able to manage all of those points of view kind of at the same time. Adam, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say that's true. And I think this applies not just for coding, but no matter what your job is, right? At the end of the day, you always have to understand multiple angles to attack a problem and understand what the root of the problem is that you're trying to solve. It's very tempting, still for me, even just to jump in and start coding something and building a solution. But if you don't start asking some of the right questions, you might miss what problem you're actually trying to solve. And that's when you get into user adoption issues where you build a solution for a problem that didn't exist. And the problem that did exist is still out there.
Yep. And I get, I'm kind of terrible as soon as I start coding. Solution architects will have no problem with this concept. Solution architects inside of Salesforce already deal with this on a day in and day out. They're used to assembling functionality together for users. This is if you're coming from an admin or if you're coming from a pure developer point of view. You are mixing it up with different layers. I love doing UX stuff and interaction modeling and designing those kinds of things. As soon as I write code and I'm hitting refresh to see if my error goes away, I become awful. I become UX blind, and I just see true or false or error or no error. So if I'm doing dev, I have to get somebody else to come and review the design and make sure that I'm not losing track of what things are supposed to look like, because I completely change what I just see the matrix at that point. I don't see what it looks like or how easy or hard it is to use. So here's some of these layer flows that we're talking about. You know, the users will see and interact, and I as I was drawing this up, I'm going to have to figure out how to model this, but the off-screen interactions need to have a part. You know, if an email drives somebody to come through step 2 through some notification after going through step 1, that is also part of user modeling, and you need to make sure that you keep that together, and arranging all of your pieces of code together and understanding how the user's interacting with it is very important. I like to do designs like this where I tell the entire story of a work process together, as opposed to that's pretty minute. Okay, let me pause it right there.
What is the countdown for?
Yes, it did. Technical hiccup there. Sorry about that, Adam. All right, so talking through the different types and different layers, going through your code, your Apex code, and this is, there might need to be some bifurcation here too, because you'll have different types of code. There may be client-side JavaScript, server-side Visualforce and Apex, server-side flows, LWCs executing client-side and back down, crossing all those lines, and then talking through your data model. All your code should be talking down to a fairly well-arranged group of objects for your process, and or possibly out to an integrated system. So building one of these maps kind of per function is something I like to do, so that we're keeping a holistic view of the solve and not just letting development streams and screen flows and page functions rule the day, and then we forget about the code that's tied into the back end. Got a representation here for a scheduled timer also going off. You know, may not be a user interaction, maybe different sets of users hopping back and forth, those kind of things. But keeping those maps so that you're planning all of this is another, like I said, solution architects probably have this down pat. If you're coming in as a new developer from admin or outside, this is your life. Thoughts, Adam?
Yeah, one thing I would add to this is I think this is kind of a great just representation of what a process in your org might look like. There's oftentimes many different things going on. Some are in Salesforce, some may even be outside of Salesforce. And diagrams like this can definitely help break things down. And I think when you're looking at a new anything, whether you come into an org and there's a bunch of code or a bunch of flows, breaking it down line by line and part by part is, I found, the best way to really figure out what it is that's going on. If you try to digest, 150, 200 line, 500 line code file all at once, it's not going to work. You got to break it down into smaller parts and then figure out what each of the parts are doing individually and try to piece together a diagram such as this, which can be very useful in figuring out what's actually happening.
Yeah, I think diagram is a really underrated skill for developers. And actually, with some of the best practices you'll get as a developer, it's very tempting to just start writing code and stop writing it when you're done. But the best developers will plan their code. I'm going to create these 30 functions. They're going to line up to do these 3 actions. They're going to do it on this schedule. And I've got a map out there of all of that working. So getting that together, getting to where your code is nice and bite-sized can be very important. And sometimes it's actually required.
Yeah, pseudocode definitely helps out with that as well when you start like figuring out what you want the code to do before you actually write the code directly. And once you have all of those steps in place, it's very easy to say, all right, take this one line of pseudocode, turn it into a method, have it call this other, line of pseudocode.
Sorry, go ahead, Adam. You were saying?
Oh yeah, I think pseudocode can be very valuable in that as well, where you can write a line of pseudocode, turn that into a method that maps to another line of pseudocode that then becomes another method, and you start kind of building out your code once you know what you want all the discrete parts to do ahead of time.
That's great. Yeah, no, pseudocode, I do that a lot. If I am in the right frame of mind, I will write my class containers and my function containers, and then I will just step through and put comments of everything that I want to happen first. And then I start writing my code in between the comments. So having a good structured flow with either pseudocode, commenting, all very important for designing good code systems.
And then your code, another bonus, I do that too. And your code's already commented. You don't have to go back and add a bunch of comments later and remember what everything was supposed to be doing.
Yep. I'm not as great at refactoring. That's one of the things that I need to get better at, is planning my function breakdown as opposed to writing the one big code. And I'm trying to coach people on that at the same time as I'm trying to learn how to do that. And that's important. When your code gets too long, I'm actually doing 3 things here, and I'm going to chop it up into 3 different things as opposed to one long piece of code that does all 3. So
yeah, I think we can probably all get a little bit better at that.
Yeah. All right, so one of the first things we want to talk about, and one of my favorite places that everybody can get started doing code, is in formulas. Formulas are tiny, kind of almost one-line programs that you'll write to manipulate data. They are used in lots of different places in Salesforce. Fairly similar to what you can do in Excel. Excel is a really good place to start practicing formulas. There's also a good website that I use. Have you seen Formulon.io?
I don't think so.
Free plug. It is a formula tester. So you can write your formula, and then you can create data objects that it will parse properly and show you the output of your formula. A lot of the places in Salesforce, you write formulas a little bit blind, and you only know if it's syntactically correct or not. You don't really get to see the output, which, if you're writing complicated formulas, can be important. So brief plug for Formulon.io. Good place to go test that.
Check that out.
But yeah, formulas. Go ahead, Adam. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, I think the idea of formulas and like you mentioned, similar to what you can do in Excel, you're taking some input that you can apply some function or calculation to it, and you'll end up getting some sort of output. Similar to how you remember back in school, you had different formulas they gave you with variables, right? Like the quadratic equation we see here, right? You plug in A, B, and C, and then you can calculate X. And so you take various values, you can plug it into your formula and then get a value as a result at the end. So definitely very powerful automation there and calculations happening behind the scenes.
Yep, you can build formula fields on objects. You can do it for compute on Flow, Apex, Visualforce, LWC. Actually, all languages use some form of formula, whether you're doing logic or just string math. substring, stuff like that. You don't have to love formulas. You have to be able to get formulas. If you don't get formulas, code's probably going to be hard. You don't have to like formulas, because the challenge with formulas is you are really trying to write a whole bunch of code, or could be writing a whole bunch of code crammed into one line. And it's very hard to see. I usually, if I'm working on a complex formula, I will take it out of where I'm working on it and pull it into Notepad so I can look at it, indent it, and get it there. So formulas have a little bit of a higher hill to climb than most code. And a lot of people will stop trying to write formulas and start trying to write regular code, but it's important to be able to be good at it. I find formulas really powerful flows, because I like my flow shapes to be self-documenting. And I don't like to use assignment fields to do stuff that can be done with formulas. So if you don't have a node for something to say add A to B, it takes out that logical step. Let me pull open the formulas homepage.
While you're doing that, I just want to add, I don't know if you actually know, you can add comments into formulas in Salesforce as well to help make them a little easier to understand.
Where do you add them? I mean, you only get
Just
so many characters.
I think it ignores it. Use the same syntax, like
Okay.
double
Yeah, no, I've
slash.
seen that. I want to say that was didn't they fairly recently bump up the size of
Yeah, they did just
characters?
increase the size also, which will make it a little easier. But I like comparing formulas to methods in Apex, because it's kind of doing the same thing. You take some inputs, you do some calculation, and then you get some output at the end. So when you are writing formulas, you're basically coding without even knowing it.
Yeah, we spent about 15 minutes before this call with me mixing up the two words formulas and functions and using our planning for this. So absolutely agree. They are just little functions. But here's some of the operators are considered formula components and operators, concatenating date and date value. I used to hate doing date math, but now I love doing it. They've increased the number of functions that are available. So let's look at one formula really quick. This is looking at the AND formula, and it is also, or the AND functions, it's also using the if function on top of that. So AND is comparing the value of two parameters, which are separated by a comma. It can do many, and if they're all true, if they all evaluate to true, then AND will evaluate to true. And if is looking for true or false. And so if both of the things in AND are true, then if will get a true, and therefore if true, then it will execute the second parameter, which is small. And if else, it will be null. So this is a text formula that is trying to figure out if these two statements are true, if price is 1 or less than 1, and quantity is less than 1, then the whatever it is small. Otherwise, it's not returning anything.
I'm not sure what it is we're buying there. Something that costs less than 1 and is a quantity of less than 1. So if we buy 0 of something for 50 cents.
99 cents. Is it dollars or
but you have to buy less than 1 of it, though.
Yeah.
What can you buy less than 1? I can
pallet?
buy half of something for 99 cents. Maybe that's an interesting formula there. But
exactly. Don't try and bring logic into this logic, Adam. You will just hurt us both.
One thing to note there, and I think it actually says it in the on the page there, the second line at the top, you can also use the double ampersand as a replacement for the AND function, which I like personally because it reads a little bit easier in English. So it'll say, if price is less than 1, ampersand, ampersand, quantity is less than 1, then it should be small. And that's how you do it in code as well. So another way you could be coding without actually coding, but the AND function works just as well.
Yep, and that's one of the things. So and paren. One of my favorite coder friends taught me, when you're speaking code, paren and thesis. So the way you say parenthesis, open paren is paren and close paren is thesis. So paren, if paren and paren price. This speaks to dialects. So it could be kind of a synonym, but sometimes and the double ampersand is just simple ampersand. And sometimes simple ampersand means two different things. Simple ampersand can also mean concatenate, and double and can mean and, the binary operator on, off, and if this is true and that is true, that's where and is used. And then sometimes it's used to be Paul and space and McCollum equals my whole name. That's a concatenation of a string, so different use. But different languages accept different variations on how these functions and operators work. So be aware as you're working through it and writing language. I want to say that it's LWC that had some JavaScript variation. You can use double ampersand. I don't know that you can use and if conditions inside of LWC. And that's in JavaScript or something. There's something there that I had to get used to a couple of times, that ampersand was doing something. The OR operator is two pipes together. But anyway, sample formula. Anything else on that topic?
I guess in general, you can see on the left side there how many functions there are you can use in formulas. I definitely don't know all of them. So there's definitely a lot you can do. So I recommend if you're building a formula, exploring some of these functions and seeing if you can accomplish what you're trying to with something already built in. You can save yourself the trouble of recreating it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've seen people go through a lot of trouble recreating something that had a formula already. So go through, this is your kind of basic functional alphabet. Make sure you have that down, or at least an awareness of what's there, because it can save you some time. All right, there's my green border again. All right, Apex. You want to start us out here, Adam?
Sure. So Apex, you may have heard of it before, but it's Salesforce's primary backend programming language. It is, I like to describe it as like 95% similar to Java with some Salesforce secret sauce baked in there. Also similar to other object-oriented programming languages. So if you've worked with any of them before, Apex should be somewhat familiar. And the biggest places you'll find Apex, there's really two primary places. One is going to be in Apex triggers, and triggers are going to fire similar to other automation in Salesforce based on some sort of database event happening. So that's going to be objects getting created, objects getting updated, objects getting deleted, or even objects getting undeleted. If you bring something back from the recycle bin, you can fire off some Apex code. And
I lost your audio.
Oh, back now?
You are back now.
Okay.
Sorry. And it's some my internet connection is unstable.
Oh, no worries. What was the last thing you heard?
It probably got recorded on the Zoom, so we can probably just ignore me and I'll go back and check the video and make sure that it's all there.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess it's just me that I couldn't hear it.
Okay, I'll keep going then. So in addition to triggers, which fire based on database events, you can also put code in classes. And a couple reasons you'd want to do this. For one, triggers will only fire based on database events. You can't really call a trigger from anywhere else. And so if you need to reuse some code or want to build some logic into your code, classes are definitely the way to do it. And classes are just code files you can call from triggers. You can call them from other classes. You can even schedule them to run at a certain interval, and a lot more easier to reuse code without some of the limitations that come with triggers. You can also use classes as the backend controllers to make calls to the database for front-end technologies. So think about things like Visualforce, like Lightning Web Components. They can all use Apex controllers, which are classes that'll do things behind the scenes on the Salesforce server side you can't necessarily do in the front end.
Yep, Apex is pretty much your backend heavy lifting engine for now. I say it's heavy lifting. All of your front end technologies can or probably have to end up calling Apex to do any of the backend data work. You can propose some, you can bring some of it up, but there's a good chance if you're working in any of the other front end languages that you will end up needing to do Apex. So when you talk about Salesforce development, Apex is usually what people are talking about. I would say, we'll talk about flows here later, but this is still, if you're a developer, you will need to know Apex. If you're wanting to write code, that job is still around Apex.
Yeah, and Apex is
discover.
where you're going to. So I was going to say, yeah, Apex is a lot of it. Again, I would recommend going line by line, but a lot of it's just variable creation. If statements, for loops, calling other methods within classes. And so again, if you're coming from another programming language, it's all going to be kind of second nature to you. But it can be a little overwhelming the first time you look at it. There are some little quirks that you have to get used to.
Yeah, a lot of struct based knowledge. If you haven't been working with struct or other data accessor um, systems, then yeah, there's a little bit of extra overhead to learn on top of that. Totally great. Nice thing is that Apex is accessible with a lot of different tools. You can use the web-based dev console. You can use VS Code. It is very, very highly exposed. And when you write stuff in Apex, there are very simple operations to add decorators to make sure that it exposes an API. So you can make your code, your Apex code, consumable by different web consumers or foreign systems.
One other thing I just want to point out real quick is kind of a quirk of Salesforce, probably for the best, but it can be annoying at times, is that you cannot actually write or change Apex directly in production. And so, if you're coming from the admin side where you're used to being able to, edit formula fields and edit, flows and things like that, the only way to get code into production is to write it in a sandbox, make sure it has code coverage, and then deploy it to production. So
Yes.
I can add a little bit into your DevOps process there, but I think ultimately it's for the protection of not making code changes directly in production and breaking critical processes.
Gotcha. Yeah. Spoiler alert, test coverage. That'll be another big concept that you have to learn. So deploying Apex code to production has to go along with code coverage as well in test classes. And that's a special type of unit testing code that can be enforced inside of Salesforce. So be ready for those. Those can be fun or challenging depending on your personality type. All right, SOQL. Well, and call back to one of our previous statements. This is a very important language to learn inside of Salesforce. This is their data access or data read language. It is similar to the SQL language that is one of the core languages for all programming and internet, modern era computer systems or database access systems. I think data weave is coming along, but SOQL is still how you get data out of a database to start working with it inside of code. It's a pseudo language. It was designed to be kind of a natural spoken language. You can almost say what you're wanting to get out of it, but it gets a little bit more complex than that. I think if you're coming from an admin, this is similar to the structure you do for building Salesforce reports. I don't do a whole lot of that. I go straight to Dev Console. I've been speaking bad SQL for many, many years. So learning the nuances of the SOQL dialect has been a little bit of a challenge, but not much. If you've got a SQL background, SOQL, however we pronounce it, is not bad.
Yeah, I think I'd just add on to that. Like, if you are familiar with building reports, that's really the same process. You choose the objects you want the report to be on, you choose what fields you want to display for the objects, and then you put in some sort of filtering condition. And at the end of the day, that's all a SOQL query is. It's what fields do I want from which object, where which condition is true.
And if you are coming from SQL, SOQL is taking advantage of some built-in Salesforce magic with objects and relationships, and identity keys. SOQL almost always assumes that you need an identity key, and if there is an identity key, it automatically knows where that relationship is. There is no having to go out and discover and map and create inside of your query a relationship that has been built in the database. SOQL is able to access that natively. So relationships are easier to write in SOQL than SQL. But if you're expecting to have to do that stuff, you have to kind of take your hands off the steering wheel and trust that it's done that way. And once you understand the nuances of ID fields and how they're translating that across and contain references to the other objects that they're relating to. It makes perfect sense, but it does take a while to let go of that. DML. So for writing data to a database or to objects, SQL, gosh, no, I'm tongue-tied. At SQL, there is you can do update and delete statements. You can write data manipulation language or statements inside of regular SQL. SOQL is for reading, and DML code is for writing and doing updates. Adam, my tongue's busy being tied. Can you talk us through here?
Sure. Yeah, I love the idea of considering this a language because it's like 5 words long, and so it's great. Hey, I understand. Learned a new language today. But basically, yeah, it's words that help you make changes to the Salesforce database. So these are going to be things like inserts, updates, deletes, undeletes, or even upserts, which are kind of an insert update hybrid, right? If you upsert some records, it'll search for the record kind of automatically. And if the record does not exist in the database, it'll insert it. If it does exist in the database, has an ID, it'll go ahead and update it. And so that's definitely a useful one as well if you don't know whether or not some records exist. I like to compare it to the kind of button clicking in the Salesforce UI, right? I can make as many changes to records as I want, but until I click that save button, Salesforce is going to ignore it. DML kind of works the same way. I can create a record in my Apex code. I can populate it with a bunch of fields, but until I put in that insert statement or that update statement, Salesforce is going to ignore it. And so this is basically how you make changes within your Apex code to records. And there are some different ways to go about it. There's also a way to use the database class to insert records in bulk, but also the option to optionally partially insert if some records fail. So if I'm inserting 100 records and one of them fails, and I try to insert them all at once using the insert statement, they're all going to fail because one of them failed. So I could use that all or none parameter in the database.insert command to basically say, hey, if one fails, that's fine. Please insert the other 99, and then I can figure out what to do with the one that failed. And so definitely some creative ways to get around some of that as well. Maybe sometimes you want it to be that if one fails, they all fail, and that's fine too. But definitely good to know that options are there to make it a little more flexible.
Yep, the operations, these are basically SQL verbs that only take proper Salesforce data objects as parameters. So you're passing collections, lists of IDs. You can't pass a string, I don't think, to any of these. You could pass an ID as a string to delete per ID. But it is kind of mixing metaphors a little bit with being kind of SQL language and kind of developer code there. So it's interesting. And then there's also some fun piece on top of what else Adam just talked about. You can also, there's some short lines of code where you can tell the database or the system to version the information you're about to send in, and you can set save point, do your inserts, and if everything does what you want it to do, you go on like everything was normal. But if it doesn't, then you can revert and you can roll back a set of changes. So that's another built-in thing that I never considered anything having that kind of middleware, because in the old server and database mentality, there wasn't that same kind of smart. So there's some stitching there that makes Salesforce fairly easy to come in and do that. But if you're looking for that handle, it's not there. As a legacy programmer like me, that was a fun thing to not be able to find for a while. And by fun, I mean infuriating. All right, Visualforce, web template language. This is one of the earlier custom interfaces. I keep hearing about S controls. I've never written or encountered an S control, but I know that predates me a little bit in the Salesforce development phase. This is a front-end templating language. If you come from PHP, ASP, or Cold Fusion, it'll look very familiar. It's got its own tag-based structure. It hops in and hops out of HTML type code pretty fluently. It's no longer being pushed, and I think somewhat it is. It's not being deprecated. It'll be out there for a while, I'm told, but they are not fighting with any kind of performance issues anymore. I've seen them deprecate some functions as opposed to try and correct them in Visualforce. So it's still a powerful language. Templating language, there's still a lot of resources out there that you can go find a public repository with Visualforce solutions out there and use them, but it is not in favor as kind of a preferred dead program. It's kind of lost popularity in the wake of the development of LWC.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, this was, yeah, so you mentioned S controls, and that was like the real original like user interface attempt by Salesforce. I've only ever encountered one in any org that I've worked on. But yeah, Visualforce I think was really important when Salesforce was first kind of starting. I think it was like 2007, I want to say it came out. So Salesforce was, a couple of years mature at that point, and they just wanted some way to be able to customize the UI. And this was before browsers got really powerful in the age of all the different JavaScript frameworks. And so this was, hey, here's, a very quick, easy way, throw in some HTML style tags, take advantage of, the Salesforce kind of built-in UI, but create your own. And for what it was at the time, I think it was great. Obviously, we look at it now and say, it's a little outdated. I don't know if I want to use it still. But I think you could say that with any kind of older technology, right? For its time, it was a great revelation, and maybe now its time has passed. But I think to your point, I don't know of any plans to actually deprecate it. But like you said, I don't think any resources are really going into improving it, adding to it. I think it is what it is for now, and they'll continue to support existing Visualforce pages, but I don't necessarily foresee that direction changing anytime soon.
Yep. It also important to note that one of the key functions on this, I think you can write Apex less Visualforce, but if you're wanting to do, because Apex or Visualforce can pull data in, basic standard controller data, I don't think you have to write back-end Apex code, but I could be wrong on that. But a lot of the code behind pages for Visualforce are Apex. And so you'll write Apex functions to bring that in.
Yeah, so basically, yeah, with Visualforce, you have a couple different options. You can use, like you said, the standard controllers, which basically tie to a certain record and come with some built-in functionality, like save actions and delete actions and edit actions, I think, as well. And so you can basically build a customized record detail page tying to a certain record. It'll have an ID, and you can update its fields without any Apex. If you do want to really customize the logic, hey, when I save this record, I don't want it to just save. I want it to pop something up. I want it to send an email to someone. I want it to, take some other action. That's when you're going to need potentially a custom controller to kind of override those, or even a custom extension, a controller extension that again will be in Apex. You'll need to be able to override some of that functionality. So kind of depending on how basic your use case is, you might be able to take advantage of the out-of-the-box standard controller without any Apex. But for really anything custom you want to do from a logic standpoint, that's when your Apex controllers and your controller extensions are going to come in handy.
One of the Visualforce functionalities that I think everybody should know about, and it's probably on a deprecation path, or hopefully there'll be a replacement in LWC soon, but I still lean back on Visualforce pages. You don't have to use any of their tags. You can just use it as a container for HTML and code and calling in Apex. But it has a one parameter switch that you can set to render as PDF. So you can create PDF files with no work if you have that, the basic data is there, and then you can just say, yeah, browse this, and it tells the browser to format the data as PDF, and you can even call Visualforce pages and save them as PDF pages for sending an email and so forth. I haven't seen that somebody's come up with an LWC. There probably is out there somewhere, but I know that that's a fast one. If I know that I'm going to be shoveling PDFs here and there, I've got to save a PDF version of a page or some data. I start looking at using Visualforce as the feature. The next time I have to do that again, I will go look and see if there's a good LWC version of that. But that is an easy one. There's just render as HTML or render as PDF, and the page is instantly converted to PDF. So that's a huge bonus.
Yeah, there are a couple of those.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and it is important to say that it's not natively asynchronous. You can build asynchronous JavaScript into it, but the rendering is usually done based on actions and requires a round trip to the server to get the full data load of the page. Sorry, go ahead, Evan.
Yeah, I was going to say that there are a couple kind of tags like that in Visualforce to change the behavior of it a little bit. For example, original Visualforce was built on Salesforce Classic, and so out of the box, all the styling looks like Salesforce Classic. And so if you want to make it look like Lightning Web Components, there's another like parameter you can add, Lightning Style Sheets equals true, that will basically reformat your page in the style of the Lightning experience. So something else good to know if you do have some older looking Visualforce pages, if you want a very quick way to refresh.
Yep, and you said one of the magic words. We're going to have a different session. I think we'll actually load it first, the session on what is Lightning, because there's about 18 different uses of Lightning and Lightning Experience, Lightning Web Components. We'll be dissecting that in a different session. Hopefully that'll be the one we release before this, or it'll be out soon. But hopefully to take that apart, just be aware that Lightning is kind of a branding thing with Salesforce and doesn't necessarily mean the same thing every time you hear it. All right, LWC, today's favorite version of Lightning. This is the most recommended application development venue. So if you're taking a job as a modern developer, you will need to know Apex, and you will probably be doing some LWC. This is the preferred front-end development language for Salesforce right now. It is based on web standards, but it is a slight variation. It's based on modern definitions of the ECMAScript standard, but is not perfectly browser runnable JavaScript. So if you played with native JavaScript or played with jQuery, it's kind of in the same vein. It does work in the browser. Your HTML and your code is sent to browser and processed there, and different libraries are pulled in to make everything work. So you are writing fairly normal JavaScript, and your code that runs logic and browser logic and display logic is all the same code until you call back to Apex to get data. If you're doing any data changes, data queries, you will need to use Apex, but everything else is sent up to the browser and runs in browser. They have jumped through a lot of hoops with the framework library for LWC to make sure that the LWC components can be have a little bit of a security barrier around them. In theory, you'd be able to have LWC components and they can't talk to or see the rest of the web page because they're being processed and handled differently. So it gives you the ability to embed controls that come from different sources and run them with an expectation of security that those controls, those other libraries can't scrape your screen and phone home with data. So it's a tremendous uptick in the shared world of multi third-party library development standards. It's also shaped and resized to where it can be used on mobile, reusable in page components that are able to be resized and reflowed on different devices. So it's really, this is their front-end language of future, and it's Aura was around temporarily, was a temporary king, but this is its days have gone. It's sunset a little bit. Unless you have a very specific reason to work in Aura, which is also called Lightning Components without the word web in the middle, I would work with LWC. Adam, sorry.
Yeah, so I think Aura, maybe we should have put the Aura slide first, kind of to get to the progression. But yeah, the kind of, if you are coming from a non-Salesforce developer background, Lightning Web Components is definitely the place to jump in, and hopefully a lot of it's going to be already familiar to you. I think with Visualforce, it was entirely, custom made and entirely Salesforce specific. And Aura, to some extent, is the same way. But Lightning Web Components, the idea was to take advantage of some of the built-in powerful browser functionality and make it as lightweight as possible, be able to take advantage of existing languages like HTML with JavaScript. And when you build a Lightning Web Component, it's not going to be a Visualforce file, an Apex file that's specific to Salesforce. It's going to be an HTML file that uses HTML. It's going to be a JavaScript file that uses JavaScript. And, like Paul mentioned, there are some Salesforce specific things to keep in mind and take advantage of while building on Salesforce. But a lot of it is going to be not necessarily just native to Salesforce. It'll be more universal, like an HTML template tag or a div tag that is going to be more universally accepted. And I think that's really hopefully helping Salesforce reach out to kind of a new group of developers that might not necessarily have looked at it before. Lightning Web Components are, as it says, runs more in the browser, so it's supposed to be a lot more performant. And the idea is Salesforce is trying to partner with a lot of these industry standards boards to really help be on the cutting edge of making things as performant and innovative as possible as JavaScript and other languages of the web continue to evolve. The idea is hopefully that LWC will evolve as well and keep up with those standards.
Yeah, the investment in learning LWC is an investment in learning HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, which if you leave the Salesforce ecosystem, still works. Apex, not so much. Apex is Java-esque. You'd have a lot to relearn if you were going to some other platform or some other stack. But hopefully, you're bringing people in, but also maintaining the investment in that language learning. Because your time is your investment. I treat my skills like stock, and I only invest in stuff that I know is going to survive and have the broadest use possible. So learning LWC is definitely worthwhile and will continue to pay off. JavaScript is the central interactive function of all web-based technology. So that and HTML together, no wasted time learning that.
Yeah, one other thing to note, real quick, the CSS, because I know between the three HTML and JavaScript, I think, sound good. CSS kind of scares me a little bit. And so there is the option to write your own CSS if you want. Salesforce also does have some built-in CSS libraries, the Lightning Design System, that help you avoid having to custom build your own CSS. But again, the option is there. If you love CSS, you're great at CSS, or really need something on top of it customized, you can build your own as well, or take advantage of the library Salesforce offers.
Aura. So yeah, as previously mentioned, that slide may have been a little bit out of order. That came in between Visualforce and LWC. It is kind of similar in that it's a JavaScript interpreting JavaScript. Its containers are a little less intuitive, I think, than LWC's. I find LWC a lot easier to move into than the componentization of Aura or the Lightning components. I've had to reach back and use some stuff in Lightning components because a library had been developed for it and one hadn't been developed for LWC yet. Same concept as that PDF rendering functionality. There's some stuff that's been built in it that you might need and so might still use. It's not, I don't think it has a sunset date yet, but just probably not being developed any further and probably a diminishing returns on your skill set investment.
Yeah, I think I'd say similar to Visualforce. So Aura was kind of Salesforce's first attempt at embracing the whole JavaScript, responsive design wave. And this was kind of created, I want to say 2015, 2016, somewhere around there. I think it was 2015 at the time when Lightning Experience came out, and JavaScript frameworks were pretty heavy in what they needed to do. And so Salesforce kind of took advantage of this open source Aura framework to create this whole component structure. Like you mentioned, the JavaScript is probably closer to JSON than it is actually JavaScript in many cases. And so kind of like with Visualforce, it was great for its era, it served its purpose. But at this point, again, I think all the resources are going into Lightning Web Components. So if you do need to build a new component, LWC is definitely the place to start. You might encounter some Aura in your orgs as well. And it is structured somewhat similar to LWC. There's this idea of a component bundle that'll have a component kind of pseudo HTML file. It'll have a controller JavaScript file, a helper JavaScript file, an optional CSS file that all kind of work in conjunction to build a custom UI.
Yeah, it wasn't as friendly with native JavaScript. You had to do some hacks to get the Aura interpreter to read JavaScript, and you were able to, the security controls weren't as stringent. You could not trick Aura, but Aura didn't enforce some of the same security containerization controls that LWC is adding, has and is adding to regulate. There's been a big uptick in the evolution from Locker service to Lightning Web Security changes. So there's evolutions in the way that the framework is processed. Framework processes security boundaries that Aura, was pretty primitive at. Never dealt with the performance problems with Aura, but I know that it's definitely not as does not have the ability to be as fast as LWC is.
My understanding, I could be wrong, my understanding was there's less parsing that the browser has to do, because with LWC, there is some standard HTML and there is some standard JavaScript, and there's a little bit of Salesforce stuff on top of it. But with Aura, it's all custom. So for the browser to be able to interpret it, it has to parse pretty much everything. And so just that extra effort needed to parse every single little thing, turn it into HTML and JavaScript the browser can actually render, is what kind of had that performance hit compared to LWC. But I think in general, it's probably still more performant than something like Visualforce would be.
Cool. Never got into that deep. Probably won't. All right, this one is fun. This is exciting. And if you're a developer, you should be looking into, if you've got a development background, this is an extremely powerful part of the Salesforce ecosystem. Salesforce Functions, and it is the name. This is another hard name that needs a translator, and you need to hear the two words together. This is part of the confusion that Adam and I got into earlier. There's functions in Salesforce, and then there's Salesforce Functions, quote, end quote, around that. Salesforce Functions together, just like Lightning Web Components and Lightning Components, are two different brand names that have spaces in the middle of them that are fairly confusing. Salesforce Functions is an implementation of headless compute resources, basically Lambda functions. If you come from AWS space, the ability to have a piece of code and reference it on a high-level compute infrastructure like Heroku, like AWS, like GCP. You're not running inside of the Salesforce, your org's IO and CPU space. The IO space, yes, the CPU, no. You're able to pass arguments out. Functions are spun up wherever they're at. You're charged kind of based on usage. You don't maintain the server. You don't own the org. They're provisioned dynamically. They run your code, and they process three different languages currently. They run your code. They're able to call back into your org and get data. They are very tightly woven, so they're basically trusted as on-prem resources. You don't have to write a whole lot of security code to make sure as you call out to the system that you're operating in a secure context at all. You're able to call out, make use of this unlimited CPU and bring the data back. And that's one of the things we probably should have covered in Apex. We've got another session coming up on limits. In order for Salesforce to be, brief spoiler on that, in order for Salesforce to ensure the performance of all of its orgs, everybody running together in the cloud on multi-tenant architecture, you are only allowed to do so many of certain types of data access or logical operations per session, per minute, per time, per org, per 24 hours. They have lots of governor limits built in that keep people from writing code, that tries to keep people from writing infinite loop code, asterisk, so that org performance isn't impacted, and therefore if you're sharing hardware with somebody else, you're not impacting their performance too. So that was the birth of the multi-tenant bounty that Salesforce brought forward. It came with the caveat that you could only do so much at a time, and you had to work within this operation. So there's a lot of Salesforce coding techniques that are built around these limitations. Salesforce Functions is that let-off valve. You can crank as much data, as much CPU as you can think of in these kind of rented, dynamically spun up spaces, and send all of your heavy workload over there, whereas before you might have had to use third-party controls or talk to a different service using a different cloud provider. And now you can just spin something up, and this is really tightly woven in the Salesforce ecosystem. How'd I do?
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, pretty good. I think the other thing I'd add is that middle bullet there. One of the nice things that excites me as a primary Salesforce developer is I can write other languages in Salesforce, right? I can write Java, I can write Node.js, I can write TypeScript, and I can even potentially learn those languages as something I wouldn't normally do if I'm just coding in Salesforce all the time. And so if you're coming from, again, a non-Salesforce developer background, you might already know how to write all these languages. And so you can potentially start putting these to use immediately. So the common use case they talk about is processing large sets of data that are going to potentially hit your limits. On the Apex side, you might be able to build a Salesforce function. And if you search for Salesforce functions recipes, you can see some samples of these functions in action where they're writing Java and Node.js to process large sets of data, but have it run from within at least build it within Salesforce, even though it's running elsewhere. So definitely a development that excites me as a Salesforce developer. And again, hopefully attracts non-Salesforce developers to say, hey, everything that you're doing, you can also do that same thing in Salesforce.
Yeah, and as a prolific professional copy paster, the next bullet is the big piece for me too, is there's a ton of open source shared public libraries out there written in Java and other languages that you can basically port in line for line and reuse that open source code inside of Salesforce. You don't have to rewrite an Apex variant. You don't have to refactor it so it's performant. You can just call, and like I was talking about PDF generation, there are Java PDF libraries out there that you can just go download, pull those into a Salesforce Functions project, and send your data and have it generate a PDF and not have to jump through any other hoops. There is an additional license, I think, with using functions, but it is so exciting to have that accessing all of the world of code that's out there on Git, not just the Salesforce code, not just the App Exchange library. Everything written in all of these very standard languages is now there for you to pull in and use, very tightly bound with Salesforce, is a huge benefit.
Yeah, I think anytime you can expand your kind of horizons into new technologies, it's a win for your career overall. So highly recommend looking into this feature.
All right. Flows. I love me some flows. So this is becoming, I think you can almost apply for a developer job and have flow be your skill and that be okay. If there are very few times that I've had to capitulate when I've challenged development teams. I'll bet you could do that in flows. No, we have to do that in Apex. Nope. It doesn't, you don't have one of these three secret things that I know flows struggle with. And if it doesn't have one of those, we can do it in flows. Flows come with, so flow is, if you haven't seen, I would go out and look at flows. Flows are a declarative language, and it's basically a drag and drop programming system. It looks, if you've used Lucid or Visio or drawn flow diagrams in PowerPoint, you're really dragging and dropping and configuring what shapes and boxes, and you're drawing arrows to the next steps and dragging groups of arrows to make loops. So you're really just programming in a more graphical interface. Apex code is easier to read than zeros and ones and machine language. So that's a more graphical version of code than what's actually executing at machine level and on the compiler. Flows is just one step up from that. It's more shapes, it's more visuals. You can see the patterns. There are fewer ways to do steps in a process in flows than there are in code, which means that we all agree on a little bit different, on the same kind of flow pattern-ish, and it makes it much easier for us to read other people's flows. There are some classical coding concepts that you need to know that flows also are subject to governor limits. But yeah, Adam, what do you think about that? Can you just come in and say, I'm just going to learn flows. I want to be a developer, but I want to be a flow developer. Is that job out there yet?
I don't know if it's out there yet. I think, well, one of the things I've noticed is that I keep trying to come up with, basic Apex examples. And every time I come up with an example, I think to myself, I have to caveat it now with, I know you can do this in Flow, but I want to demonstrate how Apex works. And so I think it's definitely a strong skill to have, and another example of you coding without actually coding. I think the biggest difference between a Flow developer and an Apex developer at this point is just the syntax, right? Where do the semicolons go? Where do the curly brackets go? Where do the parentheses go? But other than that, I think it's really all the same concepts. And so the same skills you need to write code are really the same skills you need to write flows in Salesforce. And so I don't know quite if it's exactly a one-to-one mapping just yet, but it's definitely getting there. And with every new release, more functionality is getting added. The use cases specifically for Apex only are definitely decreasing.
Yeah, my top three for things that flows can't do, and the first one I'll asterisk is number of records, because I do have a way to do more than enough records. Flows have a limitation in the number of steps they can go through. So that kind of is a part A and part B of number one for number of records that flows can process. If you get over a certain number of records, you start having to jump through a different set of hoops. I've got a good pattern that may be an exploit for jumping through hoops, but so far nobody's told me to stop doing it, so that's why I keep the asterisk on that one. See my event flow infinite flows video. Number two is large amounts of in-memory processing. So if you pull the 50,000, the largest number of records you can pull in at any one time is 50,000 elements. If you're just pulling an ID and a name with 50,000 records, that's not a whole bunch of memory. If you're pulling the entire object with tons of fields into it, that is a decent amount of memory, and you will choke the flow governor limits on memory as you go through processing. It also doesn't have an easy way to do struct to struct, where you can say, for element this, find this element in this other 50,000 record set, match those together and give me the result set. So that high in-memory processing, where you're trying to look at data structures together, that's number two. And then the third one is kind of an easy one. There's stuff like lock records. I've never had to do that. I've had one project where I've had to do that. And we were able to write a quick piece of callable code that's from flows, that was a flow action that called and locked a record, because there was no way to do that inside of flows. There's no object you can go in and say, insert a record into this object and that marks this other object as locked. That functionality is still apparently only accepted. Everything else I've been able to do, as long as you can manage the complexity, the number of steps and the number of records you're trying to process. I love getting the challenge of, no, you can't do this in code. Yes, I can. Let me show you. Let's sit down. We may have to reformat it. You may not be able to do it the way you're talking about, but we can usually get there. But I'm excited for the day when that gets considered a full-fledged automated development tool. I think most of the time, if you're hired as a developer, there's probably an expectation that there's an existing base of code out there that's in Apex that you're expected to maintain or add on to. And it's very seldom that you should get to go in and kind of throw down and say, nope, we're not doing any automation in Apex because I'm a flow developer and that's how we're getting this done.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's one of the probably harder parts of the job, actually, right? You can know how to write Apex, you can know how to write Flow, but when you do one over the other, right? If I come into an org that has a very complex trigger structure around an object, I don't necessarily want to create a small little flow just to do one thing if there's already an existing set of code for that object there. So in that case, it might make more sense just to make a small edit to the code, even though I can do it in Flow. It doesn't necessarily make sense to re-architect the whole thing or to add another spot to go to troubleshoot things. So I think that that's a big part of it as well. Back to your point on what Flow maybe isn't great for, integrations, I would also probably argue are still primarily Apex for now. I think Flow, as I saw, can do some outbound messaging, but I don't know that they have the full API to API sort of connection. I think maybe with platform events you might be able to get away with some of that. But generally, if there's some sort of integration needed, I'd probably look at Apex first for something like that.
There are some, I think, some web service calls that are native to flows, but they may not be full-fledged. That is very fair. I've got to add that to number 4. And I kind of give everybody doing customization on my projects a get out of jail free code for integration customization, because yeah, if you're talking out to other systems, that almost always includes integration. Sorry, I carved that out of
For
my
now.
process. Yeah, for now. And we may have to do a star. We may have to come in and do an addendum to this to talk about there's some other types of flows that are out there in different products. So there's a we should have had a slide for this, and I'm sorry for everybody, but bonus for listening to this far into the video. Interaction Studio has a flow builder. Velocity has Omni Studio and Omni Scripts, which is a flow builder type as well. And then the non-flow flow is workflows. So another weird wording that you have to listen for. Workflows are basically little one-item configurable scriptlets, 1 or 2 rules that you can go configure around an object that are being deprecated. Workflows and process builders are the 2 technologies. Process builders, I want to say it's supposed to be a simplified version of flows. I think it's still built on the flow infrastructure. But Process Builder and Workflows have been deprecated and given a sunset date of, I think it's March 23rd this year. March.
Yeah, I always thought of
this year. Sorry.
Yeah, I always thought of Process Builder as like I never really compared it. Well, I mean, it's similar to Flow, but I always thought of it as a souped up workflow rule, right? Workflow, you can do one specific thing. Processes, you can do multiple things. And Flow is traditionally more for like screen-based functionality, but as they've added more processy functionality onto Flow, Process Builder almost kind of became obsolete, and it's now basically like a worse version of Flow for the most part.
Yeah,
I think that's why it makes sense to deprecating.
Because if you troubleshooting process builders is hard. They create a lot of weird behind the scenes names for everything. But there's a hack out there that you can take a process builder ID and put it on the flow builder editor and see the process builder as its native flow roots and go in and inspect what those behind the scenes names are. So you can figure those out. Yeah, super secret hack. I think it still works. I want to say when I tried it a couple years ago, it didn't work, but I recently had somebody tell me that it does still work. I may just have the wrong version. But yeah, it's each of its decision nodes is basically a decision fork in a flow, and you can go see that. The debug from process builders is eerily similar to all flows, except for those names that you can't see that they use behind the scenes. And like, I don't know what A1, A_, A2 _ A7 is. How do I find that? Which one am I in my process builder? Where is that? But you can apparently see that in flows and go, or in the flow view of a process builder and debug that there.
Interesting.
So, cool. But yeah, would you say flows were something, if you were starting to do dev, would you go learn flows first just to get that first experience with debugging and running into errors and stuff like that you need to know?
So if you are, I think it depends. If you're learning to code, maybe not necessarily. If you're learning Salesforce, I always recommend starting with the declarative side of the platform. That's the security model and all the declarative tools, which I guess now really is just flow and formulas, and I guess approval processes as well. But again, knowing what you need code for and what you don't need code for is one of the biggest things building on Salesforce. So I definitely try to keep up with the release notes and make sure you understand what the capabilities of Flow are. I personally am probably more knowledgeable about coding something in Apex versus it'll take me a lot longer to build the same thing in a Flow. And the orgs I work on tend to be a little bit bigger where there's already a bunch of code in place. But I say if you are starting out in a newer org, definitely understand how Flow works and know the capabilities. And if you can build the Flow, follow the mantra, clicks before code, wherever possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would say the big thing to understand about flows, and I totally agree with that. I don't think learning flows would really help you. It helps you some with your structured knowledge. It'll help you with some of the concepts if you get an advanced flow, but I don't think your investment in time, if you're looking to be an Apex or LWC developer, will even out. The flow builder is a web builder, and that is the IDE as well. So debug is unique to Flow Builder. Errors are unique to Flow Builder. Running and debug and testing are unique to Flow Builder. You can do test classes on flows, but your Apex code, learning Apex and learning VS Code errors and the IDE is its own half of the equation. I mean, it is a decent amount of VS Code setup just to get started with Apex. I still love Dev Console because of you just go in and start writing Apex, it's already there. But you do still have a lot of IDE Dev Console quirks that you've got to go learn. What does this error mean? What is it telling me? No reference, stuff like that. And they won't be the same. Those don't translate between IDEs very well. So might give you a couple of good things, but probably not as many. Oh, all right. I'm going to stop sharing, see if I can do this. Up here, let's do a real-time comparison. All right, so front-end code, so real-time consulting version, architect, solution architecting. When would you use which component, Adam? When is it okay to use Visualforce?
So I'd say if you're building something new, one of the biggest use cases is that you mentioned PDF rendering. I think is a great use case for Visualforce. I think, honestly, my current or the only place we're using Visualforce anywhere is when we need some sort of like redirect URL, because you can't really create a URL from an LWC. You need some sort of URL to use as a redirect. So we use a Visualforce page specifically as a redirect URL. It's a very small, like 3 to 5 line page that exists for the sole purpose of having a URL to redirect to that we can then call some other thing to run from the
Gotcha.
Salesforce side.
Visualforce is set up as a page, whereas LWCN components are a little bit more modular and they're called by pages. So yeah, if you're referencing Architect, that's a great call
out. Those are probably the two, and I think you might have some others, but those are the only two that I would think of if I'm building something new. When would I think Visualforce is probably the first place I want to start?
Yeah, I cheat a little bit with my Visualforce, or I use it to cheat. I will create a Visualforce page and use no tags, and I just start using native client-side HTML and JavaScript. So to me, it's a quick place to go. If I don't have a computer that's robust enough to run Visual Studio Code, if I don't have permissions to install VS Code, I can definitely go in and create Visualforce pages in the Dev Console. Heck, I've used my phone as a PC and done dev there with on Samsung.
I don't know if I can code on a phone. That might be a little too intense for me.
Wait, you don't actually. So my phone has an output and it'll give a desktop experience. It's basically like a Chromebook built into the phone. So it just renders like a full screen PC that's an Android PC and gives you a full desktop and full Chrome experience. So that's been an easy place to, if I'm caught at my laptop fails wherever I'm at or, conference, I can get in and always have a small computer to do very lightweight dev on. But that's not a very good solution choice.
That is actually one thing we forgot to mention with LWC. With Visualforce and Aura, you can access it from the Salesforce UI if you want to look at the code. You can go into the Dev Console or even in the case of Visualforce, you can go into the setup menu and find the code there. Same with Apex. For LWC, though, there's no way to access it right now from the Salesforce UI. You have to go into some sort of IDE like VS Code. So if for whatever reason that is a limitation you're facing where everything has to be done in Salesforce for some reason, something to keep in mind. Although I would never recommend editing Visualforce directly in the Salesforce UI. That's very very rough.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Apex you can edit in one of the controls as well. Like you can go to an Apex.
Yeah, Apex you can also edit in the UI, which I would also, assuming you're not in production, which I would also not recommend. But the dev console is a little bit better. But I think to me still leaves a little bit to be desired. Sometimes I will bring up the code to look at, but very rarely do I edit code in the dev console anymore.
All right.
Well, when you will use an Aura component, I think there still are some things that you can't yet do with LWC that you need Aura for. Well, I guess also on my previous team, I think we were using Visualforce in an older Salesforce community, or I guess their experiences now, where we weren't able to get. We had like a community and a mobile app, and we weren't able to, it was like a Visualforce and Tabs community, and we weren't able to get LWCs to show up as their own tabs. Like we could put them on pages, but we had to have a Visualforce page redirect to like I think it was probably a Lightning Out web component. So that was another, I guess, use case for Visualforce that I always wanted to look into moving away from and never got around to it. But depending on how old your community is, I think now the newer experiences you can build with in some cases, the Lightning Web runtime, that I think is all LWC. But some of the older ones, it's possible you may need to again kind of use Visualforce almost as a hack to redirect to where you want it to actually go.
Yeah, because it's more directly just giving you what you put on the page and it's not being interpreted as much. There will be some cases that Visualforce gives you some more power. The biggest failing that I see when I'm using it as such, and I'll go ahead and put that, is it does not HTML4 doc typed, which means your HTML and your code, well, you may have to run Bootstrap to get some of the HTML4 functionality. You can't, the doc type is already given by the page. You're basically in the body by the time you get to a Visualforce content. I think even when you do it framelessly, it's still there. You're still nested in a Visualforce or in a Salesforce session in that page. So you do have to do a little bit of hacking there, but otherwise you get really straight up HTML. Sorry,
Is it HTML4 or HTML5?
I think you're right.
Yeah, I don't know if I've heard of HTML4. I imagine it is a thing. That's how we got HTML5, but
you're right.
yeah, or yeah, I'm trying to remember what some of the
doc type HTML is the HTML5 declaration. You're right.
Okay. I'm trying to think of the use cases for Aura over LWC. I feel like there are, like similar to the render as PDF Visualforce, there were some things you could do with Aura that I think you have to wrap. I think it might be in regards to like some navigation capabilities, where I know you can put an LWC into an Aura component, but you cannot put an Aura component into an LWC component. But I think there are some hacks where you need to use an Aura component to basically navigate to whatever Lightning Web component you want to get to. I don't remember the specifics, but I'm pretty sure there's something around navigation. Similar to what I was mentioning with using Visualforce as a hack to like a placeholder to navigate. I think there might be some other use cases as well.
Yeah, and I think we're going with both of these on the edge and getting those out of the way as we start to talk about LWC.
Sure.
Yeah, and so I think we're about there. We'll try, maybe we'll think of some other ones, but um, the web standards
Yeah,
based.
web standards, most performant, I would add also.
It is, the standards base means that it's open and being constantly developed, which is nice. Had a lot of interesting times during the browser wars where Mozilla and Microsoft were building their own Netscape, and IE had its own version of JavaScript for a while, and you either wrote for the most popular browser or you wrote code, and you had to have forks of your code depending on which of the browser camps your users were in. This means that everybody, and that was because they were stagnating. Nobody was contributing. Everybody was doing their own thing. And so to get new features built in, you had to do them yourself. And people did them themselves. Well, Salesforce took the cool high road of picking the standards organization, becoming a member, and adding to it as opposed to just building their own and making it be yet another standard. So it'll still be built, and hopefully everybody will be contributing to it as opposed to deviating from it.
Agreed. Yeah, I think for me, the standards is one of the biggest ones. Just, keeping career options open. I don't have any plans to move away from Salesforce anytime soon. But always good when you have skills that can be used elsewhere. A little bit easier. Just, keep the flexibility there and keep your options open if you want to start dabbling in some other technologies, even if you're primarily working on Salesforce. I think the skills are a lot more directly transferable than with something like Visualforce or even Aura. So definitely makes that a little bit easier. Always fun to learn new technologies. So,
and in the world of mobile, those skills are still a big deal. So if you want to customize and flavor, LWC is a good place to go mobile. If you go native mobile, which is a lot of the press for many solutions right now, those skills are also reusable. You might be sitting on a different, middleware front end, but the hybrid, the HTML interpreting native app is very popular right now, supporting the skills. LWCs, I believe, are very reusable within page components. Visualforce, can you drop a Visualforce page into a Lightning component?
you can, I don't believe so, but I know you can build Visualforce components and use those in different Visualforce pages. But I don't think you can put any Visualforce in Lightning Web Components as far as I know.
Okay. I do know, well, and the other piece is LWC is supposed to be much more user-friendly, mobile use case friendly.
I think, again, going back to the industry standards, if you have your own kind of technology island and everybody has to build towards you, it's a lot less incentive for them to do so, as opposed to if you're using the same standard framework that everybody else is using, and there's nothing else new that anybody needs to build, you can just start using it. So that probably helps with that as well.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right, I think that's pretty fair. I think
that's pretty good, yeah.
The razor that I use whenever, really LWC should be your starting place. That's preferred. And then only special cases do you go up for Visualforce or Aura. I would say stay away from Aura just because it's going out of favor a little bit in deference to LWC. Visualforce, if you've got to use it, I don't think there's a fuse behind it anytime soon. It'll still probably be able to do what it needs to do. So I don't push people away from Visualforce if it's got a good reason. One of these good reasons is there to use it. You don't need to worry about security. You don't need to worry about, if you had to create a Visualforce page for a redirect, I wouldn't say, no, we shouldn't do it because it's Visualforce. I'm not just prejudiced against Visualforce as a technology. It's still there. It still does what it does. It doesn't have all the security features that LWC has, but it's still running in the same context as LWC. Your LWCs can maybe come from a less trustworthy source than if it's Visualforce and a less secured component. You want to be more careful about that. But otherwise, I still say it's maybe not healthy, but still perfectly fine as a solution. But I tend to be rare in that case of being okay with that. All right, let me hop back to our slideshow. All right, so yes, kind of summing up, these core languages that you can go out and study independently, HTML, client-side JavaScript, and Java, will help you. Resources, I don't know, HTML, I would say for LWC, HTML is pretty much 100% applicable. There's LWC specific HTML kind of constructs that you'll use that you wouldn't learn. Learning out of the box HTML, the browser standard that every browser and every web page is generating. Same with JavaScript. I don't think you'd waste any time there. LWC will add to that. Java, what's your call on learning the constructs and framework of Java and taking advantage of kind of the body of Java training knowledge out there to learn Apex?
I think it's definitely a great start. I think now, probably more so than in years past, there are a ton of like Apex specific resources. So if you are coming from a Java background, I'd probably recommend just going straight to Apex because you already know the basics. If you were new to code in general, some intro to Java probably wouldn't hurt. Just again to kind of capture some of the basics. You can jump into some of the kind of intro to Apex, but in my experience, a lot of them kind of assume, not all, but a lot of them assume you have some sort of coding knowledge already, and it's just, hey, here's the little quirks within Apex. So that's definitely a great place to go. In general, I think, like you mentioned, for the other two, there are some like HTML. There's a lot of standard tags you'll use in LWC, and there's also some Salesforce specific tags from the Lightning Component library. Same thing with JavaScript. There's some kind of standard JavaScript you'll use, and then some Salesforce specific libraries you'll need to import and take advantage of specific functionality there. So if you have all these skills already, I think you'll be able to pick up Apex and LWC pretty quickly. If you're new to code in general, definitely wouldn't hurt to learn some of these standard technologies and then see how Salesforce applies it. And Salesforce even now has a certified JavaScript developer 1 certification. So if you know or are learning JavaScript, there's a certification you can go after pretty quickly without even knowing too much Salesforce. So something to keep in mind as well. And because they have a JavaScript 1, you got to imagine now they're working on JavaScript 2 behind the scenes too.
I'm sure. Now, do you, unplanned plug, do you have a series of stuff on Apex out there? I've seen you speak on Apex in the past. Are these good? Do you have some good intro Apex?
Not yet. At some point, I'm hoping to make my own YouTube channel with some of that. I do have some Pluralsight courses on focused on the Platform Developer 1 certification, which kind of touches on some Apex, but again, kind of assumes you have a little bit of a coding background. I'm hoping to get a little more basic at some point in the future. One of my colleagues, David Liu, has a bunch of great courses on Pluralsight as well, and his website, SFDC99. There's a lot of great Apex stuff out there right now. I do not have any myself personally as of yet, though.
Yeah, and those are great plugs. I just saw that have been out there for a while. I think it's like, so you want to start learning Apex 101 on Apex Hours. There's a series out there that
Oh, nice.
I want to go look at also. But yeah, I totally agree with you. Java will give you some extra knowledge. And there is probably plenty of intro Apex that you don't need to go out and learn Java in order to get into Apex. It might help you if you're planning to lean into the new Salesforce functions. Like I said, I think that will be a huge, removal of limiters and level up your Apex functions, your Salesforce capabilities in the future. I mean, it is just basically infinite processing power where we trained ourselves to work within that governor limits life cycle. I think Salesforce functions will be there, and that'll be much more native Java, and you may have to go learn some of that and their compilation rules and stuff about pseudocode and packages and jars and stuff like that. And how to register other things that you don't have to do in Apex. It doesn't. So yeah, I would definitely say if you're wanting to be a Salesforce developer, you don't have to go learn and do that. Just be aware that that's there, and that's kind of an expansion of your world that may become more and more relevant in the next couple of months or next couple of years, however long. Yeah, big thing. Other types of code, the stuff we're really not going to talk about. But if you're looking to be a developer, get ready because you have to code to code. And you have to script to write code to script things, and script things to write code to write code. Each of the tools that you'll work with, there'll be different IDEs. Learning the IDEs and the tools that let you move code in and out of IDEs have their own languages and their own learning platforms. I have rage quit a couple of coding languages because of fighting with Eclipse. I put that angrily at the bottom of this list. It's still a very popular Java-based code development tool that can be kind of flavorized for whatever language. I think MuleSoft is still heavily versed inside of an Eclipse plugin or
In the Anypoint platform, I think. At least it was Eclipse-based the last time I used it.
They're moving. They have a web, like a hosted version of Eclipse, I think, or did, or were coming out. I don't know what that progress is. So fact check that before you take that as gospel. But that was still used for an IDE. Git, Jenkins, Data Loader, the CLI, all different places. All different tools that you may have to learn how to use just to move code around. It's one of the reasons I love Dev Console, immediate gratification. I don't have to go learn a new tool set or a set of tool sets to write my hacky scripty code. Adam, you want to talk us through how Jenkins, Git, you probably have a better familiarity with working stuff through these code pathways than I do.
Yeah, so a lot of this is going back to your kind of system. How do you want to get your code to production? And a lot of it's surrounding DevOps. So I think Salesforce just launched a new beta DevOps center that potentially will be helpful with this later. Git is a version control system. So instead of having to write some code, comment out the old code, put the new code in, and then ship it, and then if you have to make changes, the old code is all commented out. Terrible experience. So Git kind of keeps track of versions. So okay, I have my old version of my code. I make all my changes. I submit it. I send it to production. Something breaks. I can go back looking at my branch to see what exactly I changed, what exactly I sent to production, and maybe figure out why something's breaking. Very valuable, very common throughout the developer kind of ecosystem. Jenkins is an example of a CI/CD tool. So it's continuous integration and continuous development. Basically, it's a tool, at least I believe, pretty sure it's what it is, to basically auto kind of deploy your functionality. So you'll send something up through Git in a branch. It can be approved and merged. And then Jenkins is a tool that can basically take that and send it to production on its own. So you don't have to be sending things manually through change sets. You can have a tool like Jenkins that'll basically deploy your code for you from one Salesforce environment to another. Data Loader, is used to primarily, load data in and out of Salesforce. But I know I think in Windows only, there's also some scripting you can do with it to have it run on a schedule. CLI stands for Command Line Interface. That's the place that basically gives you a terminal to write various scripts in. And with a lot of the tools out there, those integrated development environments, IDEs, scripting is definitely very useful. We have scripts in our org that do different things. There's also various commands to do things like, creating new branches and submitting to Git. But tools like VS Code, which is the primary kind of Salesforce IDE they recommend now that they have built all their extensions for, has a bunch of these commands built in. You can even add additional extensions to be able to basically use Git without having to know all the scripted commands for it. So a lot of that's personal preference at this point almost, right? There are buttons to create branches. There are buttons to, commit things. There are commands you can run or even extensions that you can send code for review as well. But definitely scripts are also very useful in that regard too. And that's where the command line interface will help out to basically to run some of those scripts at the command line level. Going back to IDEs, VS Code, again, is the most common, or at least is a Salesforce recommended tool now for writing on Salesforce, but there are others as well, again, kind of based on personal preference. The old one used to be Eclipse before Salesforce adopted VS Code. Another very popular IDE you'll find, not just for Salesforce, but for development in general, is IntelliJ. And IntelliJ has its own kind of Salesforce extension called Illuminated Cloud. So if you're already using IntelliJ for coding, you can use it to code on Salesforce as well. And again, it's kind of personal preference. Every developer has their own tool they like, their own settings they like. And so it's really up to you what you want to use. Ant I never got into too much, but I believe that's another tool you can basically use to deploy data to different orgs. So you can package things up into a certain folder structure and then use it and run some commands to basically deploy files to different orgs. I'm not sure how commonly it's still used. I imagine there still are use cases for it. I've not used it in a little while though.
Some stuff still. I think there's some
that might be
things that still use Ant, and gosh, and back in the Java days, I think Ant was part of the make process, and I never got that deep. If you had to compile something, I wasn't interested. I've always loved the scripting languages and the just-in-time compilation languages. Didn't like compiling. Too impatient or too much of a adrenaline coder. Something's broken, I have to fix it. Cool. Yeah, and so each one of those may have their own version of the CLI. Data loader, remind me on our synonyms one, that's a good one, that there are two different things called data loader inside of Salesforce.
Oh boy.
I spent a week trying to find the Windows-based data loader because I believe that one is data loader, all one word. No, data loader, all one word is dataloader.io. There's a partnership with a paid tool that you can use for free. It's kind of wizard driven inside of Salesforce, but sort of not.
Is that the import data wizard?
There's the import
data wizard. Or data import wizard, sorry.
There's data import wizard, then there's dataloader.io, and then there's data loader, which is the Java-based Windows batch file that has its own language. So there's three things to pull in data. Two of them are called data loader. One's data space loader and one's data loader. And
dataloader.io, I think, is actually run by MuleSoft, if I recall correctly.
Okay, that makes sense. But yeah, if you go look for it in setup, I hadn't used them a lot, and I went and looked for data loader, and I kept typing data loader, all one word. And when I typed data space loader didn't come up in the search results. So I just kept typing data loader, and I got one result, and it was the web-based. And unless you type data and then space, the autocomplete wouldn't pull that up.
Interesting.
So I couldn't. And it may have just been an ID10T error, I just managed to not see it, not find it, and type the wrong thing over and over and over again. But it is fair to know that those aren't out there. If I did it, somebody else can do the same mistake. So.
Yeah, I didn't even know dataloader.io was accessible in the setup menu now. I'm guessing with the MuleSoft acquisition, they figured, well, we own this now too. Let's throw this into setup menu as well.
It predates the MuleSoft acquisition. Honestly, I think it was.
So MuleSoft, it was powered by MuleSoft before Salesforce acquired it, but I don't think it was in the setup menu back then. And then once Salesforce acquired MuleSoft, they probably figured, well, now that we also own this tool, let's also add it to the setup menu. Because I had used it before, but I still didn't know it wasn't set up.
Yeah, I don't know that I could recommend, if we did an apples to apples comparison, I don't know that I would recommend it for too many things over the data import wizard. Since it is putting your data in an external system, even if it's a Salesforce owned ecosystem, I still have trouble if I'm working with client data. Like, I don't have an agreement. have trouble hopping into putting client data into data. I wouldn't put that in dataloader.io where I might I have no problem using the data import wizard.
Yeah, well, Data Import Wizard has limitations on how many records you can upload, which objects you can upload, and it's only for import. So sometimes that's where a tool like either dataloader.io or the Data Space Loader or even Workbench could come in handy as well.
Data Space Loader, a large amount of records. Dataloader.io, also without a license, also has a very limited amount of records that you
That's a good point. Yeah.
So yeah, I think they were. I want to say it's like 10,000 versus 50,000, but usually if you're thinking about data loading, then yeah, it's not too. It hasn't been very often for me that I've been in the under 50K records, so that it mattered. So
sounds right.
Well, that's all I had. Did you think of anything else to add for folks on their journey?
No, I think we got a good amount of content for today. Yeah, hopefully whether you're a new developer, you're an existing non-Salesforce developer, or even you're a Salesforce developer, you may learn something new.
Yep. If you've got any questions about where to start poking on any of the topics or any of the terms that we brought up, feel free to post them in the YouTube channel and we'll try to get to them. I haven't been great at responding to them before, but you have both of our Twitter handles to reach out or hit us on YouTube and let us know. Adam, thank you again very much.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.